Hey guys, part 2, Flat Stanley, his original adventure. The Museum Thieves, chapter 4. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the lamb chops. Mr. Dart was an important man, the director of the famous Museum of Art downtown in the city. Suddenly, Stanley Lamchop had noticed in the elevator that Mr. Dart, who was ordinarily a cheerful man, had become quite gloomy. Uh-oh. I'm having trouble with my mirrors again. There we go. Nope. Oh, boy. Quite gloomy, but he had no idea what the reason was, and then at breakfast one morning he heard Mr. and Mrs. Lamchop talking about Mr. Dart. "I see," said Mr. Lamchop, reading the paper over his coffee cup. That's still another painting has been stolen from the famous museum. It says here that Mr. O.J. Dart, the director, is at his wit's end." "Oh dear, are the police no help?" Mrs. Lamchop asked. "It seems not," said Mr. Lamchop. "Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. We suspect a gang of sneak thieves. They're the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying. Meanwhile, I hope people will buy tickets for the policeman's ball and not park their cars where it says don't." The next morning, Stanley Lamchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. "These sneak thieves work at night," Mr. Dart said. "It is very hard for our guards to stay awake when they have been on duty all day. And the famous museum is so big we cannot guard every picture at all times. I fear it is hopeless, 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 hopeless." Suddenly, as if an electric light bulb had lit up in the air above his head, giving out little shooting lines of excitement, Stanley Lamchop had an idea, and he told it to Mr. Dart. Stanley, Mr. Dart said, "If your mother will give you permission, I will put you and your plan to work this very night." Mrs. Lamchop had given her permission, "But you will have to take a long nap this afternoon," she said. "I won't have you up till all hours unless you do." That evening, after a long nap, Stanley went to Mr. Dart in the famous museum. Mr. Dart took him into the main hall where the biggest and most important paintings were hung. He pointed to a huge painting that showed a bearded man wearing a floppy velvet hat, playing a violin. My goodness. It's hard to do this. I'm going to tell you that right now. And I can't seem to do up. It's very counterintuitive to what I would think. And a lady who laid on the couch. There was a half-man, half-horse person standing behind him, and 3 fat children with wings flying above their heads. That, Mr. Hurt explained, was the most expensive painting in the whole world. There was an empty picture frame on the opposite wall. We shall hear more about that later on. Mr. Dart took Stanley into his office and said, "It is time for you to put on a disguise." "I already thought of that," Stanley Lamchop said, "and I brought one. My cowboy suit. It has a red bandana that I can tie over my face. Nobody will recognize me in a million years." "No," Mr. Dart said, "you will have to wear the disguise that I have chosen." From a closet, he took a white dress with a blue sash and a pair of shiny little pointed shoes, a wide straw hat with a blue band that matched the sash, and a wig and a stick. The wig was made of blonde hair, long and done in ringlets, which are curls. The stick was curved at the top, and it too had blue ribbons on it. It's a crook. It's shaped like this. "It's a shepherdess disguise," Mr. Dart said. "You will look like a painting that belongs in the main hall. We do not have cowboy pictures in the main hall." Stanley was so disgusted. He could hardly speak. "I will look like a girl," he said. "That's what I will look like." Wish I had never thought of this idea. But he was a good sport, so he put on the disguise. Back in the main hall, Mr. Dart helped Stanley climb into the empty picture frame. Stanley was able to stay in place because Mr. Dart had cleverly put 4 small spikes into the wall, one for each hand and foot. The frame was a perfect fit. Against the wall, Stanley looked just like any other picture. "Except for one thing," Mr. Dart said. "Shepherdesses are supposed to look happy. They smile at their sheep and at the sky. You look fierce, not happy, Stanley." Hold on. skipped a page. Stanley tried hard to get a faraway look in his eyes and even to smile a little bit. Mr. Dart stood back a few feet and stared at him for a moment. Well, he said, it may not be art, but I know what I like. He went up to make sure that certain other parts of Stanley's plan were taken care of, and Stanley was left alone. It was very dark in the main hall. A little bit of moonlight came through the windows, and Stanley could just make out the world's most expensive painting on the opposite wall. He felt as though the bearded man with the violin and lady on the couch and the half-horse person and the winged children were all waiting, as he was, for something to happen. Time passed, and he got tireder and tireder. Anyone would be tired this late at night, especially if he had to stand in a picture frame balancing on these little spikes. Maybe they won't come, Stanley thought. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come at all. The moon went behind a cloud, and then the main hall was pitch dark. It seemed to get quieter, too, with the darkness. There was absolutely no sound at all. Stanley felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle beneath the golden curls of the wig. The creaking sound came from the right out in the middle of the main hall, and even as he heard it, Stanley saw in the same place a tiny yellow glow of light. The creaking came again, and the glow got brighter. A trap door had opened in the floor, and two men came up through it into the hall. Stanley understood everything all at once. There must be the sneak thieves. They had a secret trap door entrance into the museum from the outside, and that was why they were never caught. And now tonight they were back to steal the most expensive painting in the world. He held very still in the picture and listened to the sneak thieves. This is it, Max, said the first one. This is where we art robbers pull off a sensational job, whilst the civilized community sleeps. Right, Arthur, said the other man. In all this great city, there is no one to suspect us. Ha ha, thought Stanley. That's what you think. The sneak thieves put down their lantern and took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. What would we do? What would we do to anyone who tried to capture us, Max? The first man asked. We would kill him. What else? His friend replied. That was enough to frighten Stanley, and he was... Here's a picture. Oh, those are my dogs. He was even more frightened when Luther came over and stared at him. This sheep girl... I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max. This one looks scared. Just in time, Stanley managed to get a faraway look in his eyes again and to sort of smile. You're crazy, Luther. She's smiling. What a pretty little thing she is, too. That made Stanley furious. He waited until the sneak thieves had turned back into the world's most expensive painting, and he shouted in his loudest, most terrifying voice, Police! Police! Mr. Dart, the sneak thieves are here! Ooh. The sneak thieves looked at each other. Max, the first one said, I think I heard the sheep girl yell. I think I did too, said Max in a quivering voice. Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest. We'll get a rest, all right, shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with the chief of police and lots of guards and policemen behind him. You will get arrested. That's what. Ha ha ha. The sneak thieves were too mixed up by Mr. Dart's joke and too frightened by the policemen to put up a fight. Before they knew it, they had been handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning in the office of the chief of police, Stanley Landchop got a medal. The day after that, his picture was in all the newspapers. Chapter 5, Arthur's Good Idea. For a while, Stanley Lambchop was a famous name. Everywhere that Stanley went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, Over there, Agnes, over there. That must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the sneak thieves, and things like that. But after a few weeks of the whispering and the staring, it stopped. People had other things to think about, and Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came a further change, and it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. Hello, super skinny, they would shout, even ruder things, and about the way he looked. Stanley told his parents how he felt. It's the other kids I mostly mind, he said. I don't like me anymore because I'm different. I'm flat. Shame on them, Mrs. Lambchop said. It is wrong to dislike people for their shapes. or the religion, for that matter, or the color of their skin. I know, Stanley said. Only maybe it's impossible for everybody to like everybody. Perhaps, said Mrs. Lambchops, but they can certainly try. Later that night, Arthur Lambchop was woken up by the sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room and knelt by Stanley's bed. Are you okay? Arthur asked. Go away, Stanley said. Don't be mad at me, Arthur said. You're so mad because I let you get tangled up the day you were my kite, I guess. Skip it, will you? I'm not mad, just go away. Please let's be friends, Arthur said. Arthur couldn't help crying a little too. Oh, Stanley, please tell me what's wrong. Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. The thing is, I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape, again like other people, but I have to keep going around being flat. It makes me sick. Oh, Stanley. He dried his tears on the corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. Don't talk about what I just said, Stanley said. I don't want the folks to worry. That would only make it worse. You're brave. You really are. He took hold of Stanley's hand, and the two brothers sat together in the darkness, being friends. They were both still sad, but each one felt a little better, knowing better than he had before. And then suddenly, though he was not even trying to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up, turned on the light, and ran to the big storage shed where toys and things were kept. He began to rummage in the box. Stanley sat up in bed to watch. Arthur flung aside a football and some lead soldiers and airplane models and lots of wooden blocks, and then he said, Aha! He found what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up, and Stanley looked at each other. Okay, Stanley said at last, but take it easy. He put the end of the long pump into his nose and clamped its lips tight so that no air could ease out. Okay. I'll go slowly. If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand and let me know. He began to pump. At first, nothing happened except that Stanley's cheeks bulged a bit. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle sign. So he kept pumping. Then suddenly Stanley's top half began to swell. It's working, shouted Arthur, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get inside him more and more easily. He got bigger and bigger. The buttons of his pajamas burst off. Pop, pop, pop. A moment more and he was all rounded out, head and body, arms and legs, but not his right foot. That foot stayed flat. Arthur stopped pumping. It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons, he said. Maybe a shake would help. Stanley shook his right foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one. There stood Stanley Lambchop as he used to be, as if he was never flat at all. Thank you, Arthur. Thank you very much. The brothers were shaking hands when Mrs. Lambchop strode into the room. We heard you up and talking when you ought to be asleep, eh? Shame on you. George, Stanley is round again. You're right, said Mr. Lambchop, noticing. Good for you, Stanley. I'm the one who did it, Arthur said. I blew him up. Everyone was terribly excited and happy, of course. Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them. And then they turned out the light. Good night, they said. Good night, said Arthur and Stanley. It had been a very long and tiring day. Very soon, the Lambchops were asleep. The end. I hope you enjoyed Flat Stanley, his original adventure. You can take out other ones, or you can maybe look on Epic and see if you can get another one. The second one is called Flat Stanley, Flat Again. And maybe I could do a sneak peek for you. See you next time.